The sewing frame was upside down in a builder's skip on Kestrel Street, with a torn bag of plaster resting on the crossbar. 41 years I had worked at that frame. My hands knew the exact place on the left upright where the varnish had worn through to bare oak, because that is where my palm sat every day of my working life. It had rained in the night. The iron fittings had already started to bloom orange. Maybe you have seen something of yours in a place like that. Not stolen exactly, just thrown out by somebody who could not tell the difference between a thing that was old and a thing that was finished. 11 days later, a young man would stand in that same building and hand me an envelope of rent he had been paying, for 18 months, to a person who had no right to a penny of it. My name is Raymond Holloway. I am 71 years old. I have already told you what my daughter tried to do at my bank. This is the other thing, the one that happened first, and in some ways the one that hurt worse, because a bank account is only money, and that frame was where I learned my trade. I need to explain the workshop, because nobody in my family ever understood what it actually was. For 41 years I was employed at Marchetti & Sons, a bindery on the east side of Corbin Falls. Payroll, pension, the whole ordinary arrangement. That was my job. The workshop on Kestrel Street was something else. It was mine. In 1988, a 2-story brick building on Kestrel came up for sale after the man who ran a sign painting business out of it died. $14,000. It had a leaking roof, no heat, and a stairwell you would not send a child up. Eleanor and I looked at it on a Saturday in July, and she said, "Ray, if you do not buy this, you will talk about it until you die." We bought it on the 14th of August, 1988. I want to be precise about how we bought it, because this is the fact my family never knew and never once thought to check. We did not buy it in my name. Eleanor's father, Walter Corley, had spent his life as a foreman and had watched 2 of his brothers lose everything they owned because their names were on the wrong pieces of paper. He sat us down at his kitchen table and he said, "Put it in a company. It costs $40 and it costs you nothing else, and one day it will matter." So we formed a small holding company, 2 shareholders, Eleanor and myself, and 1 asset, the building on Kestrel Street. We named it after her, Corley Holdings, and for 38 years the deed and the certificate of incorporation sat in the second drawer of the workbench in that building, in a brown envelope, under a tin of beeswax. Here is the thing about that workbench. Walter Corley built it in 1961 out of laminated maple, 4 inches thick, 10 feet long, and he bolted it through the floor into the concrete slab because he did not believe in furniture that could be moved by one man. It weighs somewhere over 600 pounds. In 65 years, that bench has never left that room, and in 65 years, nobody but Eleanor and I has ever opened the second drawer, because the second drawer sticks, and you have to lift it slightly and pull left, and if you do not know that, you will decide it is locked and leave it alone. Everybody in my family thought I rented that building. I never told them otherwise, not out of cunning. It simply never came up, and when Curtis asked me once what the rent was, I said, "It is manageable," because I did not want to have a conversation about money with my son-in-law. There is one more habit I should mention, and I mention it now because it is the kind of small thing people laugh at. Every January, for 41 years, I updated an insurance schedule. Not a policy on the building, a schedule of tools. A named items rider with Ashfield Mutual, listing every piece I owned individually. The frame, the standing press, the board shear, the nipping press, the finishing tools, the type, the brass, the bone folders. Each one described, each one with its serial or maker's mark where it had one, each one with a current appraised value. My premium was $11 a month. Every January, I sat at that bench with a cup of tea and went down the list and adjusted the values. And every January, Eleanor said the same thing from the doorway. "Raymond, nobody is going to steal a 1952 board shear." And I said the same thing back. "It is not about stealing, Ellie. It is about somebody one day saying it was worth nothing." She would laugh, and I would keep writing. 41 Januaries. The last one I did alone. The winter I got ill was 2 years ago. I have mentioned it before. A chest infection that would not clear. 6 weeks where getting to the bathroom was the whole event of the morning. Diane came by more. Curtis came by twice, both times with a folder. Somewhere in week 4, Curtis raised the workshop. He said, "Ray, you are paying rent on a building you have not been inside since October. That is money going out the door." I said, "Leave it." He said, "At least let me deal with the contents. Get them stored properly. You cannot leave good equipment in an unheated building all winter." And I said, "And I want to be honest with you about this, because it is the only genuinely careless thing I did in the whole story." I said, "Do what you think." I was 69 years old. I had a fever of 102, and I said, "Do what you think" to a man who sells insurance for a living. He came back 9 days later with a clipboard and a pen already uncapped, which is a thing salesmen do without knowing they do it. He said, "I have got a fellow interested. He does printing. He would take the lot." I said, "Take the lot." He said, "All of it. One price, saves you a storage bill of about $200 a month, which over a winter is $1,200 you are not spending." I said, "Curtis, some of that equipment is older than this country's interstate system." He said, "That is sort of the problem though, Ray. Nobody wants old. Everybody wants digital." I asked him what the fellow's name was. He said he would have to check. I asked what the figure was. He said they were still talking. I asked whether anything had been signed, and he said, "Nothing is signed, nothing is happening. Do not worry about it." And he wrote something on his clipboard while he said it. I have thought about that clipboard a great deal. A man who has nothing arranged does not arrive with a pen already uncapped. I said, "I want a list." He said, "A list?" I said, "Of what goes? Item by item?" He said, "Absolutely," and he wrote that down too, and I never saw a list, and I did not ask again, because on the 11th day my temperature went back up, and for a fortnight after that I was not asking anybody for anything. 3 weeks later, Diane brought me a check for $4,000. She put it on the tray table across my knees, next to a cup of soup she had made, and she said, "Curtis sorted the workshop. It is all handled. You do not have to think about it." I said, "Sorted how?" She said, "There was a man who wanted the equipment. It is just old tools, Dad. 4,000 is generous. Just old tools." I did not say anything. I want to tell you that I said something magnificent, and I did not. I looked at the check and I looked at the soup and I said thank you, and she took the cup away and washed it, and that was the afternoon my working life was sold for $4,000 while I lay in bed. I asked her about it the next morning. I had slept and I was clearer, and I said, "Diane, who bought it?" She said, "Some young man Curtis knows." I said, "All of it." She said, "Dad, do you want the 4,000 or not? Because if you are going to be like this about it, I will tell Curtis to unwind the whole thing, and you can pay to heat that building all winter." That was the sentence, not the cruelty, the offer to undo something that had already been done. It is a very old trick, and it works because a sick man does not have the strength to test it. I said, "No, leave it." And she said, "Thank you," as though I had given her something. I got better in March. I did not go to Kestrel Street. I have thought a great deal about why, and the answer is not a good one. I did not go because I did not want to see it empty. It is the same reason I did not go into Eleanor's sewing room for 8 months. There is a kind of cowardice in grief that looks exactly like being busy. So for a year and a half I stayed away, and in that year and a half, something else happened, which I did not learn about until the following autumn. It came out at a family lunch, sideways, the way these things do. Curtis was talking about a property he was involved with. He said the word portfolio, which is a word Curtis enjoys. He was explaining to his mother that the market was soft, but that soft markets were where you positioned yourself, and his mother said, "That sounded very clever," and Curtis agreed with her. Diane said, "Tell them about the little one on Kestrel," and Curtis said, "We have a tenant in there now. Young fellow, printing business, pays on the nose every month. The table moved on. Somebody asked about the potatoes. I sat there with a fork in my hand, and I did a piece of arithmetic that I would like to describe to you exactly, because it is the moment the temperature of this story changed. Curtis had a tenant, in a building he believed was rented by me from an absentee owner, which meant Curtis had told a young man he was the landlord of a property in which Curtis Reyes has never held 1 cent of interest and had been collecting money for it. I said, "Curtis, what does he pay?" Curtis said, $700. I said, "A month?" He said, "A month. Cash, mostly. He is one of these young fellows. Everything is cash." I said to him, "Emil, I am not fussy. Just be regular." Diane said, "Curtis has been very good about it. He goes over there himself." Curtis said, "Well, you have to keep an eye. Give them an inch." I said, "That is good." And I went back to my potatoes, and I was so calm that Diane asked me afterwards if I was feeling all right. Theo told me the rest. My grandson, 19, at the community college, the one who told me it was November when everybody else was pretending otherwise. He came on a Sunday in November, and he did not sit down. He stood in my kitchen, with his coat still on, and he said, "Granddad, did you know they threw stuff out?" I said, "What stuff?" He said, "From the workshop. When the man moved in, there was a load of it in a skip out the back. Mum said it was scrap. I took a photo because I did not think it was scrap." He showed me his phone, my sewing frame, upside down, with a bag of plaster on the crossbar. Behind it, the corner of the board sheer. Behind that, a wooden case I recognized immediately, because I had made it. The case that held Walter Corley's finishing tools, 19 brass handles, the oldest of them from 1890-something, given to me by Eleanor's father the week before our wedding. In a skip, on Kestrel Street, behind my own building. Theo said, "I am sorry, I did not know if I should show you." I said, "You should. You did the right thing." He said, "Is it worth much?" And I said no. And that was true, in the way he meant it, and it was the largest lie I have ever told a member of my family, because the January schedule in the second drawer of that bench put the appraised value of the named items at $31,400. I drove to Kestrel Street the next morning. I want to describe the 4 minutes I stood in the alley, because they were the worst 4 minutes of the last 3 years, and I include the ones in the hospital. The skip was still there, half full, the frame was underneath, upside down, the varnish worn through on the left upright, orange blooming along the iron. Somebody had put a broken toilet cistern on top of it. The rest of it I catalogued without meaning to, the way you do. A length of the board shears fence, snapped. The nipping press base, no screw. 2 of the maple boards from the standing press, the ones Eleanor's father had cut, split along the grain where somebody had levered them with a bar. Underneath all of it, a corner of blue cloth, I recognized as an apron. The alley smelled of plaster dust and wet iron, which are 2 smells I have known all my life in exactly the opposite condition. Dry, indoors, under a lamp. I did not climb into the skip. I am 71. I stood at the edge of it with my hands in my coat pockets, and I looked at the place where my palm had rested every working day for 41 years, and I could not make my chest work properly. Then a young man came out of the back door of my building, carrying a bucket, saw me, and stopped. He was about 30, dark hair, forearms like a man who does actual work, a shop apron with ink on it. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I used to work in this building." His whole face changed. He said, "You are the bookbinder." He said it like a fact he had been carrying around. He said, "There is a bench in there I cannot move, and I did not want to cut it up, so I have been working on it. Do you want to see?" And I said yes, and I followed the man who had bought my life for $4,000 into my own building, and on the way through the door, he said the sentence that decided everything. He said, "I have to be honest with you. I have been waiting for a lease for a year and a half. Mr. Reyes keeps saying it is coming." I stood in that room for a long time. The bench was there, bolted through the slab, exactly where Walter put it in 1961, with a young man's paper stacked on it, and a Van der Kook press, where my standing press used to be, and the second drawer shut. Here is the decision, and it took about as long as it takes to read it. I could have been angry at the young man. He had my tools. He was standing in my building. Every instinct that a lesser version of me has ever had said, "This is the person in front of you, so this is the person you deal with." But he had said the word lease, and he had said the words year and a half, and I have spent my life reading paper, and a man who has been paying $700 a month for 18 months without a lease is not a thief. He is the other victim. So I did not say anything about the tools. I said, "What is your name?" He said, "Emil, Emil Novak." I said, "Emil, would you mind if I opened a drawer?" The second drawer sticks. You have to lift it slightly and pull left. It came out the way it always came out, with the sound of maple on maple that I have heard perhaps 10,000 times, and inside it was a brown envelope under a tin of beeswax, exactly where it had been since the 14th of August, 1988. Emil said, "I thought that one was locked." I said, "Everybody does." I did not open the envelope in front of him. I put it inside my coat, and I said, "Emil, I am going to ask you to do two things, and neither of them will cost you anything. Keep every receipt you have for those 18 payments, and do not pay anybody anything at all until you hear from me. If anyone presses you, say your landlord has been in touch." He said, "Are you my landlord?" I said, "I will let you know on Thursday." Then I made 3 telephone calls. The first was to Ashfield Mutual, asking for a certified copy of the current named items schedule and confirmation of who is listed as owner of the scheduled items. It arrived in 4 days. 1 name. The second was to the county recorder's office, asking for a certified copy of the deed recorded on the 14th of August, 1988, and the current registered agent of Corley Holdings. Both were on file. The company had never lapsed because for 38 years I had paid a $25 annual fee that Eleanor used to call my birthday present to her father. The third call was to a solicitor named Mrs. Adeyemi, who did the conveyance on our house in 1994 and is now semi-retired and does 2 days a week. I asked her one question. I said, "If a man has been collecting rent on a building he does not own, what is the exposure?" She said, "For him, considerably more than the rent." I said, "And if I do nothing at all except tell the truth to the tenant?" She said, "Then it collapses on its own." I also drove to Ashfield Mutual's regional office on the Wednesday, because a certified schedule is not the sort of thing you want arriving in the post at an address where your mail has been interfered with before. The woman at the desk was perhaps 50 and had clearly not been asked for a 41-year named items history in some time. She went away for 11 minutes and came back with a printout that was longer than she expected. She said, "Mr. Holloway, you have been updating this every January since 1985. I said, "That is right." She said, "Most people do it once and never look at it again." I said, "Most people are insuring things they bought. I was insuring things I was given." She stamped it, and she said, "Whatever this is for, I hope it goes your way." Thursday, 10 in the morning, in my own building on Kestrel Street. I brought 3 pieces of paper and 1 photograph, and I laid them on Walter Corley's bench in the order they mattered. First, the deed, recorded the 14th of August, 1988. Corley Holdings, sole owner. The building and the lot behind it, including the ground the skip was standing on. Second, the certificate of incorporation, and a printout from the state showing the company in good standing, and the 2 shareholders, one of whom died 3 years ago and left her half to me. Third, the schedule from Ashfield Mutual, 41 Januaries of a habit my wife thought was funny. Every named item, described, valued, and 1 insured owner, $31,400. And the photograph on Theo's phone, which I had printed at the pharmacy, of $31,400 worth of scheduled property, lying in a skip under a broken cistern. Emil looked at the deed for a long time. Then he sat down on a stool, which I think was the only chair in the room, and he put his hands on his knees. He said, "I gave him $8,400. Then he corrected himself, out loud, to nobody, the way a man does when the number will not sit still. I said, 12,600, 18 months at 700. He said, 12,600. His voice went somewhere else when he said it. He said, that was the money for the Platen press. Then he said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about Emil Novak. He said, do I have to leave? I said, no. I said, Emil, you are the only person in this story who has done nothing wrong. You paid what you were asked, on time, for 18 months, for a building you were told he owned. The tools you bought were sold to you by a man who did not own them either, and you paid $4,000 for equipment worth $31,000, and you have kept the bench when it would have been easier to cut it up. I said, I am not taking anything back from you. Then I put the last piece of paper on the bench, which was a lease, drawn up by Mrs. Adeyemi, 3 years, Corley Holdings to Emil Novak, $300 a month. He said, that is less than half. I said, you are running a bindery in a building where a bindery belongs. That is worth $400 a month to me. He signed it. His hand was not steady. Mrs. Adeyemi filed it on Friday, and that was the entire payback. That was all of it. I want you to understand that I never spoke to Curtis. I never rang Diane. I did not write a letter. I did not instruct anybody to do anything. I filed a lease. Because the moment that lease was filed, Emil stopped paying Curtis, and Curtis had to explain to himself why. And when he came looking, the county record showed him a deed from 1988 with a company name on it, and if he had ever once in 9 years asked me a single question about that building, he would have known. 18 months of rental income on a property in which he held no interest, collected in cash from a young man with receipts. A $4,000 sale of $31,400 of property belonging to somebody else, documented every January for 41 years by a habit he would have called a waste of $11 a month. I did not have to do a single thing to him. He did all of it himself 2 years ago in a bedroom to a man with a fever, and it simply took this long to arrive. Mrs. Adeyemi asked me whether I wanted to pursue the tools. I said, what would that involve? She said, a demand, then a claim, then very probably a criminal referral, because the sale of scheduled property by a non-owner is not a civil misunderstanding. I said, and how long? She said, a year, perhaps 2. I thought about a 19-year-old boy standing in my kitchen with his coat still on, saying I took a photo because I did not think it was scrap. I said, no, file the lease and nothing else. She said, Raymond, you are entitled to more than that. I said, I know what I am entitled to. I am also the only grandfather that boy has. I have not spoken to Curtis. He has not come. Diane sent a message in January that said, I hope you know we only ever tried to help, and I did not answer it, because it was not a question. The frame is in my garage. I got it out of the skip with Theo and a neighbor and a length of webbing, and it took us 40 minutes, and I was no use for 2 days afterwards. The orange bloom came off the iron, with oil and wire wool over about 3 weeks. The varnish on the left upright is still worn through to the oak, and I have decided to leave it that way, because that is not damage, that is a record. Walter Corley's finishing tools were gone, all 19. I have made peace with that in the way you make peace with weather. Theo comes on Sundays. He is sewing better. His folds are still uneven, but he has stopped pulling the thread too tight, which is the harder of the two habits to break. Last month, I gave him the bone folder my own master gave me in 1969, and he did not say anything at all for about a minute, and then he asked me a question about a sewing station, and that was correct. That was exactly correct. Emil rings me sometimes about the press. Last week he asked whether I would come in on a Tuesday and show him how to back a spine, and I said yes, and I have been looking forward to it in a way I have not looked forward to a Tuesday in 3 years. They sold my working life for $4,000 because they had no way of knowing what it was worth. And the only reason I did know is that for 41 Januaries, I sat at that bench and wrote it down while my wife stood in the doorway and laughed at me. Next time, I will tell you about the Sunday my daughter-in-law set my plate on the counter beside the bin and told me the dining room was for family that contributes. She had signed something the previous spring, in a hurry, at my kitchen table. She had not read Clause 4.